Right. Hello, everyone. My name is Mahabad, and I'm the APF UN coordinator for our UN fellowship. I'm delighted to welcome you both to the American Pakistan Foundation's webinar on this year's annual ECOSOC theme, which is Eradicating Poverty in Times of Multiple Crises. Utilizing the platform that APF has with ECOSOC, our UN fellows have worked very hard and very closely on this topic, and we have organized this insightful webinar to learn more about poverty eradication and its contributing factors. I'd like to thank our board chair, Dr. Nasser Qureshi, for his support, and Amna Akram, the board lead for the APF UN program, for her guidance. Now I'm going to pass it over to Mustafa Ahmed, our distinguished UN fellow, to kick us off with introductions of our esteemed panelists. Over to you, Mustafa.
Thank you, Maha. On behalf of the American Pakistan Foundation and the United Nations Fellows Program, I'm pleased to welcome you all to this event. Just a little roadmap for our audience. I'll be doing quick introductions for each of our panelists, followed by a structured Q&A session. And then hopefully in the last 15 to 20 minutes, we expect to open this up to audience questions. So with that, I'll dive right into it. Our first panelist is Dr. Tobias Huck. He is the World Bank's current lead country economist for Pakistan, coordinating economic, governance, and private sector programs. He has worked for the World Bank for over a decade in various economist roles, including as a senior country economist for Afghanistan, a senior economist in the macroeconomics and fiscal management global practice, and a consultant economist for the Solomon Islands. Tobias has also worked at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in private sector economic consulting and in the New Zealand Public Service, where he began his career at the New Zealand Treasury. Dr. Huck holds a PhD in economics and public finance from the Australian National University, a Master's of Science in Finance from the University of London, and a Bachelor's in Political Science and Sociology from the University of Auckland. Tobias, welcome. Jemina Siddiqui is the Global Security and International Affairs Program Director at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She was previously the Senior Program Officer for South Asia at the United States Institute of Peace, where she designed and managed research and programming on democracy, governance, election-related issues, environment, climate change, and conflict in Pakistan and South Asia. Before USIP, Jemina was with the National Democratic Institute as the program manager for Pakistan, focusing on political party development, elections, and the political participation of women and youth. She's also held positions at Global Communities, the American Bar Association's Rule of Law Initiative, and the Stimson Center. Jemina holds a bachelor's in political science from American University and a master's from New York University, where she focused on democracy promotion and the rule of law in the Muslim world, culminating in a thesis on rebuilding justice systems in post-conflict Afghanistan. Jemina, welcome. And then our third panelist, Ahmed Iqbal Chaudhry, could not make it today, but just a brief note on him. He currently serves as a member of the Provincial Assembly in Punjab, Pakistan, and is also the project director for Dahliz, an NGO promoting the empowerment of local governments in Pakistan. Unfortunately, he had a personal matter and could not attend today, but for those of you who are watching this panel right now, I would also highly encourage you to check out his profile and his work as well. So starting off on a more general note, so according to the latest poverty statistics from the World Bank, approximately 9.2% of the global population, so around 700 million people, live in extreme poverty. Just in this context, extreme poverty is defined as living on less than $2.15 a day. Broadly speaking, what are the biggest hurdles to alleviating and eradicating global poverty? Start off with Tobias.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mustafa. It's great to be here today. And I mean, I think what you've posed there is an enormous and very broad question. But ultimately, I think a large part of the constraint that we face to poverty reduction is the policies in place in many countries in the world. And I want to be careful in terms of how I frame that to avoid any sense of blaming the victim or saying that the solutions are simple. That's not at all what I'm saying. But I think that what we've learned from 70 years plus of international development experience is that if certain ingredients are in place, certain institutional and policy ingredients are in place, it is possible for countries to escape poverty and large proportions of their populations to escape poverty. And I guess those institutional ingredients, I mean, while there's a lot of variance around the world, there's a lot of different recipes that make sense. I think some of the key ingredients are political stability, macroeconomic stability, a macroeconomic environment in which there isn't massive inflation, where there isn't foreign exchange crises, where there's basic respect for property rights in some way. I don't mean that in a kind of classical neoliberal way necessarily. I think there's different ways in which property rights can be respected. But I think if there isn't that basic respect for property rights, if there isn't the capacity for individuals to invest and reap the rewards of their investment, it is very difficult to grow an economy. And then I think, beyond those kind of very, very basic underpinnings, it's clear that the private sector has typically played a very important role in driving economic growth. There are a few countries that have achieved sustainable economic growth and sustainable poverty reduction without leveraging the kind of fundamental energy of the private sector. And then finally, I'd say that political leadership is critical as well. I think what we've seen internationally is the countries that have achieved rapid growth, rapid poverty reduction have done so by building some kind of collective action, some kind of cohesion around a vision of economic development, and the elites, the political elites, the business elites within the society have been able to mobilize around that vision. So what we call the kind of basic ingredients, it sounds easy in theory, but I think in practice it's very difficult. And I think what we've seen through history is that only very few countries, and very recently, in comparative historical terms, have managed to achieve all of those ingredients at once. And I think that's really the big challenge. And I think multilateral agencies like the World Bank and the UN and the IMF and many others, World Trade Organization, really play a key role internationally in encouraging and supporting countries with the implementation of those kind of institutional environments. I could speak more, but let me stop there for now, and perhaps we can come back and dig into some of that a little bit later in the session.
No, absolutely. Thank you for that response. Jemina, any words on that question?
Yeah, no, I think Tobias gave an excellent overview, and I don't have much to add. I'd like to pick up on the thread of kind of in political will and inclusion. For me, from my experience, I've spent almost 20 years working on Pakistan with all the various organizations you mentioned. And so I've seen, the spectrum from, very local government, civil society organizations, all the way to political leadership. And it has to be inclusive, right? So whatever plans, I agree, the private sector has a huge role to play. Governments do as well, political leadership. Training, though, technical assistance to understand, like people understanding what it means to improve a country's macroeconomic and microeconomic situation. Things that, providing education, understanding that you need to shift your economies and your to look at, new areas. Agriculture is not going to sustain any country forever, right? So you have to think about how you train the next generation within that country. So in the case of Pakistan, thinking about green technology, how you do that at a low cost scale. For example, I'll give one, the USAID invested in part of their green plan in collaboration with Pakistan, EV battery factories and manufacturers and EV cars. That's wonderful. But if you're and marketing EV scooters, electric scooters, but the average middle-class person in Pakistan, yes, they might be able to get discounts to purchase those items, to be able to get to a job in a low cost way, as well as, hopefully protecting the environment. But how do you repair those, right? So you also need to think about your industries and your companies that are growing around these very high level changes to improve the economy, improve the environment, and lift people out of poverty, as many politicians like to say, here and abroad. But thinking about those was very tangible, measures to make it more inclusive. So as the private sector and as the government thinks about, how they improve their economic situation, thinking about, where investments in new technologies, new training, new platforms, education writ large, how that can be improved to help people, understand the challenges that their country is facing and that they're personally facing.
Yeah, great points from both of y'all, and you both touched on themes of security, stability, and environment, and obviously wrapped up within this discourse on global poverty is the subject of climate change and its impact. So just another, again, big picture perspective, what impact do emerging security threats like climate change or regional conflicts have on poverty eradication efforts? And how can we design poverty reduction efforts to account for the adverse impacts of climate change? I think we'll start with Jemina on this question.
Sure. So this is something, my almost decade at USAP, we've been, struggling with and working to do, that we seeded a number of programs when I was there to look at kind of how you work on a very small scale to develop models. And, I think there was some interesting ideas. I think it has, like I said, it has to be inclusion is the word of the day for me. I've been reading about it a lot, again, over the last few weeks. But how you think about addressing challenges like, it's not just regional conflict, it's in domestic conflict, domestic terrorism, whether it's between political parties, between non-state actors and the government, between communities, right? So how you look at community and social cohesion and conflict resolution within communities. These are challenges that the state, it ebbs and flows in Pakistan, right? When they want to reach out to minority communities, marginalized communities, the governments do so, right? When it's there's the social capital available and the political will to do so. Climate change, I think, it's a whole of government approach to address it. It's not. I've been arguing for a number of years. And there has been some headway that look at climate change as a national security issue. It should be up there with counterterrorism efforts. This is not going to, this impacts everyone. I was in Karachi during the last floods in 2022, and the poorest of the poor were impacted, and the wealthiest of the wealthiest in Karachi were impacted by standing water, no access to clean water, electricity shortages. It didn't matter if they had generators and other facilities to be able to, they were still stuck in their homes and they faced property damage as well. Same thing happened in 2020. So thinking about it and learning from previous historical floods, like you had 2020's example, and the same mistakes, if not more, were made in 2022. Yes, the scale of it was larger, but then you had the 2005 earthquake to learn from it. There's these models that think about how you address the immediate issue, the immediate humanitarian crisis, and then the ramifications of that, which has led to more extreme poverty in Pakistan. So the whole government approaches and thinking of these things as national security challenges. It gets it on the radar of the most senior officials, and it also gets the attention of the international community. When you're taking it seriously, the international community will realize, yes, this is a partner we can work on these particular issues.
No, thank you for that perspective. Tobias, anything to add on that front?
Yeah, no, I mean, I really like how Jemina framed that. I was also working in Pakistan in 22 when the floods hit, and I thought that was, I think it was a very instructive experience, because I think what that really showed us as well is that like resilience to climate change is not just about climate policy. It's not just about environment policy. It's about everything, really. Right? I mean, Pakistan was so hard hit by that crisis, and we had such a sharp increase in poverty because it triggered a macroeconomic crisis. Why did it trigger a macroeconomic crisis? Because Pakistan was already at higher levels of debt. It already was very short on foreign exchange reserves. There was already a lack of confidence in the economy. The private sector was already reeling. So you have an external shock like that, and it really pushes people off the edge, and it's very, very difficult for them to recover. So if you actually have an economy that's growing, if you have an economy where the government is managing the macroeconomic situation well, where you have reserves, where you have fiscal space to borrow more when you need to, then these kind of shocks are much more easy to deal with. And finally, I mean, I would come back to this point on the private sector as well, which is to say, if you have a private sector that is responsive, that firms can invest freely, where individuals can invest, where they can move their funds around, where they can borrow, where they can access finance, where they can achieve the regulatory approvals that they need to rebuild a factory or rebuild a business, your resilience to this kind of shock is going to be much stronger as well. So yes, you need the cross-cutting environmental policy, you need a responsive disaster management framework, all the rest of it. But you also just need a functioning economy in which people have the capacity to respond quickly to the shocks that they face and get back on that investment train, like recover, reinvest, create new jobs following a shock. So getting the foundations right, again, I think is very important here. The only other point I would add as well is I think one thing that Pakistan did very well was we had the Benazir Income Support Program, which is a cash transfer, unconditional cash transfer program that covers about a quarter of households who are at the bottom of the income distribution. So a lot of the poor are covered by this program. And having that kind of social protection system in place can be extremely useful from shielding those really hardest hit from the worst impacts of this kind of crisis. So I think that's something else that we would be recommending that governments pay increasing attention to in future. If you have a general purpose social protection system in place, you're going to be resilient to economic shocks, but you're also going to be resilient to security shocks or climate shocks or whatever kind of shock come down the pipe at you. So yeah, let me stop there.
Mustafa, I just wanted to add on this that it's not just that immediate cash transfer. The fact that women have to get their national identity cards makes a huge difference because they are on government roles. They're recognized by the government. So if you think about people who can then find jobs, whether the middle class has boomed in Pakistan not over the last pre-COVID it was women were joining the workforce, even or doing small businesses at their homes, and a number of organizations, the World Bank, the UN, other bilaterals were investing in training and providing skills to women, and then they could go and set up their small businesses, whether it was from their home or work outside the home. And so it wasn't just that immediate impact, but this long-term impact that BISP has had, I think is something that it's good that across governments it's continued. It's reduced and ebbed and flowed, but the model has continued. And I think that is something to the Pakistani political system's credit, I would say.
Yeah, great, insightful answers from both of you on this topic, especially drawing on Pakistan specific context regarding both the fiscal and monetary aspects of its economy, its recovery, the challenges it faces. Just kind of drawing on that thread a little bit. What ways can international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, how can they maybe be reformed or leveraged to better support poverty eradication initiatives, both maybe in Pakistan and globally, especially right now because we see Pakistan, the IMF's relationship get a lot of international attention. Very pertinent question. So Tobias, maybe from your perspective in the World Bank, what any thoughts on this subject?
Look, I mean, I think it's a great question. I mean, and the way I think of this really is that you hear a lot about, well, the IMF is making the government do this, or frankly, the World Bank is making the government do that. And I just think that's a little bit of a mischaracterization of how international financial institutions work and how aid works in general. And I think that there's really a lot of international evidence that shows that aid it's a tool, right? It's a bicycle. And if you don't know where you're going and you don't know how to ride a bike, it's not going to be nearly as useful, right? And you know, perhaps in certain situations it can actually do damage, right? So I think what we look for when we speak to government is we look for a counterpart that we're working with who has a very clear objective, who has a clear vision of what they want to achieve with the financing that we're providing. And that where we think there's going to be a sustained buy-in and sustained effort from the government, from the private sector, from the politicians, pulling together in the same direction. It's when you get that clear direction, that clear intention, and the IFIs can come in and provide some financing that supports the achievement of that objective, that's when you get real results. I think what we see too much in Pakistan and many other countries as well is that aid is seen as something that's going to be the solution or can be the solution to the problems. And it can't. Money by itself will not solve the problems facing a country like Pakistan when so many of those problems are actually derived from the underlying failure of policy, the underlying institutional weaknesses. And I think everything we know about development really shows that, you know, Stephen Durkin wrote a wonderful book about this called Gambling on Development. But I think it's more a consensus view in the entire development literature that unless you actually have a critical mass of political leaders, business leaders, what they term elites in the literature, unless you have a critical mass of elites who actually have a vision for national development and are prepared to push and make compromises to achieve that vision, aid is not going to get you out of that. At best, aid can ameliorate some of the costs in the short term and provide a little bit of financing to stabilize the economy. But aid will not drive the long-term poverty reduction. It will not drive resilience unless the government has got a clear policy intent and is prepared to drive the policies through that would enable faster rates of growth. And I think this is the problem that we've seen in Pakistan. We're now on the, I've lost count. I think we're on the 24th or 25th IMF program. And every time we have an IMF program, I think there's a hope that this time it will be different and that we will really get to the difficult reforms that need to be done. But so often what happens is we start with a lot of ambition and then the politics gets too difficult and we end up with much more of the same. 6 months later, a year later, 18 months later, we end up in another macroeconomic crisis and another IMF program, and the game starts again. So all of which is to say, right? I mean, you know, obviously that is not to say that IFIs are off the hook. We have a responsibility to support government's objectives. We have a responsibility to be responsive, to be flexible, to give government the benefit of the doubt. If they believe they know what the solutions are, I think we have a responsibility to get on board with any viable reform trajectory that the government is articulating. And I will also be honest that I think I'm sure we can do better at that. I'm sure that other donors can sometimes do better at that, at being ideologically flexible, at being pragmatic about being responsive. But ultimately, I think that even with all of that, you're just not going to get real change unless there's a government that has the will and the capacity to push the policy and institutional reforms that really underpin growth and development.
Jemina.
Yeah, I agree with Tobias. And I would just double down on one thing is the flip side of it is the accountability, right? The transparency. Where is this money going? Especially when it comes to infrastructure projects, you know, when it comes from IFIs, when you have bilateral donors, so the Brits, the Americans, the Canadians, everyone. Transparency in the data collection of what, you know, the donor aid is being used for, but then also training the local civil society to be mindful of and understanding what they need to be monitoring, So at some point, I remember, I think maybe it was in Nepal, the World Bank had tried something with social audit programs so that communities would be able to audit. And I don't think I ever heard of any, and maybe it's my own fault that I didn't, keep track of it. But I think trying to, in addition to funding large government to government, IFI to government or government to government funding, there should be money set aside to support local civil society organizations to do the monitoring, so that third-party monitoring and validation on, technical infrastructure projects or skills development or whatever, IFI money is being used for, or donor money is being used for. I think that's as important as thinking about having that, everything that Tobias mentioned about the political will and finding partners who are genuinely invested in using the funds, not just as a stopgap, but to actually make more significant policy changes.
Thank you both for your responses. Jemina, a particularly interesting thread from your response speaking on the role of civil society, particularly looking at the role of gender and youth in advancing poverty eradication efforts, because a lot of whether it's due to internal domestic factors or external shocks, generally women and youth face the extreme brunt of extreme poverty. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak on the general gendered impact of poverty, and what position do women and youth hold in advancing poverty eradication efforts?
Excellent question. And it's not just, women and youth and marginalized communities in general, but, and poverty, but I think just how they're the one's constantly under attack, whether it's because of the poverty situation, because of terrorism and violence, because of, the treatment of women and how women are perceived, and in Pakistan as well. And how youth are, right? So, one of the things that we had been seeing over the last decade is more young people running for public office. You're not seeing that as much. You're seeing it in piecemeal, but people genuinely wanting to take an interest in their local governments or their, provincial or, on the national level. And there's a number of barriers to why, if you're not within a party system, you can't really make headway in doing that. But I think those perspectives, whether it's on the local level, when the Ministry of Planning is putting together projects, getting that youth perspective is key, because they're the ones who are going to be at the forefront of impacts, whatever the Planning Commission and Planning Ministry does when it comes to investing in projects or other schemes to be able to support youth. It's wonderful if you get a bunch of young people laptops. A lot of countries do that. Here I live in Maryland, in Montgomery County, they're giving out laptops to young people. But if there's no training on how to use those, how to be able to do remote work, how to be able to do web design or other things, that they can be stopgaps, because even if they have a full-time job, there's no way Pakistani young people can live on an income of a salaried position anymore. So thinking about how the government could, focus on that type of skills development. And again, that comes to better partnerships and understanding what the Pakistani government wants to do when it comes to their young people. You have 60% under the age of 35 in Pakistan. It's probably, and the bulk of that is under the age of 25. And so these kids are coming out of colleges, out of high school with no real job prospects. So how, and then the same thing, and then young women who are coming out are even more marginalized and more shuttered to the side, because they're told that they can't go into these areas of work, or if they do, the workplace environment is not conducive for women, right? Whether they go into the hospitality or industrial sectors, or they go and, the boom of advent of malls in Pakistan was a great hope for me for when women could start getting jobs there. But I think until you strengthen the laws on the books for women in particular, so laws on sexual harassment, violence against women, they're fantastically written laws. It's the implementation that is lacking. And it's not just for that, but child protection laws, those have implementation. So those efforts need to be strengthened. And I think there's a role for IFIs, and multilaterals, and bilateral donors to push Pakistan and other countries that are in a similar situation to ensure that they're implementing and supporting and putting the funding behind legislation to support these marginalized communities who are not just at the front lines of poverty, but the front lines of climate change, the front lines of violence, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's violence, by non-state actors, etc.
Appreciate that response. Thank you. Tobias, anything to add?
No, look, I mean, I think Jermaine has put it very well. I mean, I think I think Pakistan has some very stark statistics here, right? I mean, we got what the average age I think is about 20 years old. We've got 70% of young people saying they would leave the country if they had the opportunity. You've got a female labor force participation rate of about 25%. You've got 80% of kids in school that can't read a short text, read and understand a short text that's appropriate to their age. So we have a 40% stunting rate, child stunting rate. 40% of children are not are being permanently, their capacity is being permanently undermined due to the lack of nutrition and lack of sanitation and these environmental conditions that people face. So it's very grim from one perspective. From another perspective, I think what we've seen in Pakistan is that you have had this kind of demographic shift. You've got a lot of young people coming into the cities, especially. They're more educated than they have been in the past, despite much of the problems in the education system. And some of the political shifts that we've seen in Pakistan. Obviously we have to be careful and moderate in how we think of these questions, but I think you have seen a very clear desire for change coming from the youth in Pakistan. And I think that energy is going to only get stronger as the number of youth, the number of educated youth online, connected, accessing global knowledge and information as that grows. So I see this as a real potential vector for positive change as well. I think we've just got a long way to go, and I think that probably this is something that the multilaterals, development agencies can play an important role. Much too often, you go to a conference at the Serena Hotel, and what you'll find is a bunch of 60-year-old men with mustaches talking to each other. I mean, I'm going to be very rude about this, right? But I mean, it is very true. So the policy space is dominated by a tiny sliver of the demographic. And I think we need to democratize that space. We need to amplify the voices of those who've been excluded, because we need new ideas, and we need those with a stake who have been excluded in the past to be able to speak up for their own interests, which frankly they understand much better than anyone else does. So I think that it comes back a little bit to Jermaine's point on civil society engagement, accountability, making sure that those who have the greatest stake really have a voice when these decisions are being made, when programs are being designed, and when programs are being implemented.
Thank you both for your perspectives and your answers on this question. Before I open it up to questions from the general audience, I want to return back to another question of like fundamentals, which is, we've talked a lot about the impact of, domestic good economic governance domestically, good political stability domestically. In the implementation of poverty eradication efforts, though, how can we maybe ensure that such efforts are resilient to economic shocks, whether they be recessions, global financial crises, pandemics, like we've seen with COVID for the last 3 to 4 years? How can we ensure that these eradication efforts are resilient to these international economic shocks? Tobias, if you wanted to start on this question.
Look, I think it's a massively difficult problem, and I'm not sure there is a way, frankly, to fully insulate domestic living standards from international shocks. I mean, if international prices go up, like we saw with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you're going to see life get difficult for people who are barely able to survive. So I don't think you can fully insulate from the international economy, and I certainly don't think you can fully insulate from natural disasters. But I think there are certain things you can do, and I would come back, and I think this comes back to two of the points I made previously. Firstly, having a well-functioning economy with macroeconomic stability in which the government has what we call policy buffers. So the government has space to borrow more money if it needs to, so it can have counter-cyclical spending, so it can spend more in the context of an economic shock. And where the exchange rate is well managed, so that some of the impacts of that shock are being absorbed through exchange rate changes and so on. Just the real fundamental, well-managed macroeconomic policy settings. It's super important, really very important. And then I think the other part of it comes to just to this, the broader environment for the private sector. If people are able to reinvest, if they have confidence in their property rights, if the business environment facilitates access to finance, people can borrow, people can start companies, people can start businesses without drowning in red tape. That means that your recovery from this kind of shock is going to be much, much faster, because people are entrepreneurial, right? People always will find a way to make something work, despite the enormous shocks they may face, as long as there isn't someone in the way stopping them from doing what they need to do. So I think some of that basic stuff, macroeconomic management and a good enabling environment for investment in the private sector, that's really going to help your resilience to this kind of shock. And then the final thing I'd mention is again, just to come back to the BISP program, the social protection system. If you have a social protection system in place, it's not necessarily going to prevent poverty. It's not necessarily going to prevent the experience of these shocks. But what it will do is make sure that the people that are negatively harmed do not fall into what we would call a cycle of poverty. If you have to sell your business, if you have to sell your house, if you have to borrow from a money lender at 50%, if you have to pull your kids out of education, you're not going to be poor for the duration of that economic shock or that natural disaster. You're going to be poor for a generation, right? So that's what you want a social protection system to prevent. You want to basically put enough of a buffer in place that when households experience this kind of shock, they can avoid that kind of very negative coping mechanism that pulls them down into poverty for a sustained period of time. So if they've got enough money to keep their kids in school, if they've got enough money that they don't have to get into debt, the resilience of that household and therefore that community is going to be much stronger. So those would, I think, be my three ingredients: the macro stability, a good environment for the private sector and for business, and a sound social protection system.
Jemina?
No, I would echo everything that Tobias said. I would add, putting on my experience working at think tanks, governments need to reflect after these types of crises. What worked, what didn't, but also look at regional comparisons, right? And everyone says SARC is dead. SARC, I think, is actually a great place for some of these broader existential challenges to just discuss. How did SARC countries deal with the pandemic? How are they addressing climate change issues? Poverty, yes, if there are models that have worked in certain places within the region, that the problem is that the broader political will is not there to engage. But I think, if technocrats on these issues can continue to discuss this, and maybe this is where, donors can, push countries to say, hey, there should be more conversations on the regional level of what worked, what didn't, and then taking that knowledge and not just putting it on a shelf, right? Incorporating into your planning process, whether it's, for example, I'll go back to the 2022 floods. If you look at the SIN Disaster Management Authority's plan for that year, they they had allocated like 70,000 tents. They needed like 3, 4, 5 times more than that. But you look at Bangladesh has been very successful in drastically reducing the number of deaths due to cyclones because of community-led activities, within They've built shelters on, higher ground. They've tasked children in certain schools to bring the elderly. They learned from one cyclone experience that people were not going to leave their livestock. So now many of these shelters have an area where people can bring their livestock. Now, those are things that would have helped people, I don't know if it would help in the 2022 floods, but because it was just massive amounts of rain and water just that came all of a sudden and the rainfall. But thinking about how you can build more resilient infrastructure and plans around these crises so that you are insulated. So having the high level social protection, everything that Tobias has mentioned, but combining that with reflection on what has worked, what hasn't, what other people within the region or in similar economic strata as Pakistan have done to be able to help and learn from not just their floods and climate change, but also the pandemic. Because yes, I'm hoping that the COVID pandemic was a once in a lifetime, once in a generational or multi-generational issue, but we don't know that. So thinking of other disasters, so like the health crises that will ensue after floods or other natural disasters, you could take those experiences from the pandemic that have worked well and apply those to the reduction in diarrhea and cholera and other waterborne disease and illnesses. So kind of thinking of this as a cross-sectoral exercise. And I think this is where, funding from, donors, and using not just international experts to come in, but finding local experts and think tanks and organizations to be able to contribute that and, get that kind of whole cycle approach would be, I think, useful.
Well, thank you, Tobias and Jemina, both for your perspectives and drawing on your own experiences and work as well. I think at this time, it's a chance to open it up to the Q&A. So for our participants in the panel, feel free to either type your questions in the chat or just raise your hand just so we can keep it orderly and we are able to address as many questions as possible. And it looks like we already have 2 questions in the chat, but from Hadia. So we'll start with the first one, which is how can we end poverty in settings where political corruption and weakened rule of law have exacerbated income and wealth inequalities? Floor is open to either.
That is the $1 million question, right? No pun intended. This is where Tobias had talked about the institutional resilience, institutional change. Countries need to realize that where there is political corruption, where there's weakened rule of law, where the police isn't the first person you go to when you have someone breaks into your house. It is, you go to your network and you find, you go to political leaders, you go to someone else to be able to address these issues. This is a generational change, right? You can't end this is, changing political corruption, improving rule of law, it's a generational thing. And so I think putting, and I don't know how much donors have the ability. I really, it'd be nice if they did to be able to put these types of requirements when there is government to government transfers of funds for specific efforts, that there is that accountability, there is transparency, and that's going to start improving the process of of the rule of law. But again, this is not an overnight fix. I think there needs to be, all sectors of society, whether it's civil society, what's the government, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's academia, all of, and the private sector, other experts, technocrats, it all need to come together. And so if the government wants to model this, then you think about how you would bring all these actors together to have a very serious and introspective discussion on how these things can be changed, but it's not going to change overnight.
Yeah,
or maybe even my lifetime as well.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I think maybe there's 2 ways to think about what development does, right? What development agencies do. I was working in Afghanistan, as you mentioned, Mustafa, before I worked in Pakistan. And that was probably one of the most difficult development settings you can imagine. I mean, it was active civil war. There was very high levels of corruption. There was just outright kind of banditry and expropriation and violence. But still, even in that context, the international community managed to set up a primary healthcare system that had a huge impact on life expectancy. It had a huge impact in terms of preventing the spread of preventable diseases, immunizations, vaccinations. All of that was able to be achieved. A primary health education system. We managed to massively increase the number of kids in school, including girls. And we had a community development program that was very successful in bringing small-scale infrastructure to a lot of villages across the entire country. That improved the lives of millions of people. It saved millions of lives, that kind of development intervention. Now, was it sustainable? No, it wasn't sustainable. And the economy was still in a terrible state towards the end. And we were not on a trajectory to address poverty or eliminate poverty. So I think, when the situation is so bad, development agencies still have a role to play in providing the very basics. And I think that's a very important role, and we shouldn't overlook that. But at the same time, I think we have to be very realistic with ourselves. Just as Jemima says, we cannot solve the problem. We cannot convert the way societies work. We cannot move a dysfunctional, corrupt society into a functional, fast-growing economy just as development actors. We just don't have the capacity to do that. At the end of the day, you require that local leadership. You require that local vision. And at the very most, we can support that and facilitate that by helping make some connections, making some transparency, by bringing people into the conversation. But ultimately, development has to be locally led. It's the only way it's ever worked.
Second question, also somewhat, I think, on that theme for you, Tobias. You mentioned the value of social protection systems. What specific instruments and tools do you think are the most effective?
Yeah, so look, I mean, I'm not a social protection expert. We have a whole team at the World Bank office in Pakistan that works on this. But I mean, what we have in Pakistan, I think, certainly is effective, and it's an unconditional cash transfer program to the greatest extent possible. We use electronic systems to move the money, and we transfer the money to the female heads of households, which is a really core part of the program, as it supports women's empowerment and leads, frankly, to better development outcomes. The money is likely to be better used if it goes to a female head of house than a male head of house. What that program has done is prevented, as I was describing before, has prevented those kind of spirals of poverty. It's provided a basic level of stability to poor households, and it's shielded households from some of the most severe impacts of poverty. So it hasn't stopped people being poor. It hasn't got them necessarily out of poverty. I don't think there's a lot of evidence for that. But what it has meant is that those who are poor enough to qualify for the program, their standard of living is being protected in a very, very important way, which prevents that kind of intergenerational poverty and that intergenerational loss of human capital that comes from outright destitution. So I think that's very effective. There's other ways of designing social protection systems. I mean, there's a lot of emphasis in some parts of the world on conditional cash transfers, where you condition access to some proportion of that payment on families sending their children to school, for example, or accessing immunizations. So you get a kind of double benefit from the existence of that social protection system. You get the direct benefit of the transfer, you get an indirect benefit from behavioral change that you're incentivizing through that transfer. The more you try and do it, the more complex it gets, and there's a certain simplicity in the unconditional cash transfer, which makes it easy to administer, right? And it's very hard in a place like Pakistan to make a system conditional, because quite often families will be living in places where they just can't access those services even if they want to. So it's complex. I think there's different answers in different countries. But certainly I think at the very basic level, an unconditional cash transfer system is a pretty effective use of development resource.
So in Pakistan, when BIS started, which was after the floods, what, a decade or so back, so there were mobile vans that went around, got women their national identity cards. The national identity cards, so they were tied to the ATM cards, so that women could access it. So I think one thing, if there's a desire to expand, I think places like Balochistan, it's much harder to get access. And so if there is, and define, because there are actually more, I think more women-headed households in Balochistan, in Quetta and outside than other parts of the country, just given the sheer propensity of violence and within and leading to these female-headed households. But one thing to do is take these things, those conditions that Tobias has mentioned, say, immunization or enrollment in school, and tie that into the mobile service that gets women their identity cards, they can be also used, dual use as, get vaccinations for children where they can, make sure that children's bay forms are filled out properly so that when they do want to go to school, that they're tied to the mother's national identity card, because some of those changes around national identity cards and, mothers being able to, children being able to be on their mothers, especially when there's not a father, those rules are changing slowly. So I think capitalizing the fact that their rules have become more flexible for women and for children, and getting their national identity cards and their bay forms, which is the precursor to getting their national identity cards at 18, getting birth registrations done. So tying that all together might be one way to kind of, you keep the unconditional part of the social protection program, but then those services, like Tobias said, where people can't access them, they're brought to them. Again, it's not very safe. They're polio vaccinated are still being killed in Pakistan on a regular basis. So thinking about how IFIs, multilaterals, and donors can support them and think of creative solutions, because these are easy wins to get more women their national identity card, to get more birth registrations in Pakistan, to improve vaccinations. This looks good for the donor when they have, especially when it comes to the US, to go back to Congress and say, look what we've done with the money we've invested in Pakistan or other countries. So I think, those are ways that as people think about how social protection programs can be improved, there's a lot of research that have been done. People read, I think, very good academic papers, and I think even dissertations on the Benazir Income Support Program. So reaching out to them and, getting their analysis and expertise and involving them in whatever next phase of Pakistan social protection programs, I think, is imperative.
Maha?
Yeah, thank you, Jemina and Tobias, for so many insightful answers. I actually had a question I really wanted to ask. So what would you say is the role of AI, if any, in poverty eradication? Because we've had conversations about how AI can lead to unemployment, which might be a factor for poverty, increasing poverty in developing countries. So how would you say AI plays into the bigger picture of poverty eradication?
I think that's a fantastic question, and I frankly, I just don't have I don't think many people, right, have fully understood the way this is going to roll out in developing countries. I think that there's probably a general sense of concern that if you're in a country where regulation is weak, where the rule of law is weak, where we don't have the capacity to regulate existing technologies, those new technologies are potentially going to be much more difficult to manage than they would be in developed countries. I think there's a lot of concern around energy usage and what that would mean in terms of the global emissions targets, in terms of how we meet those energy needs while avoiding further climate emissions that will harm those most vulnerable in developing countries. And I think there's very clearly a labor market concern as well, right? I mean, there's a sense that low-skilled jobs are those that are most vulnerable to replacement. And it is those kind of low-skilled jobs that are more prevalent in developing countries, and those kind of manufacturing jobs, industrial jobs that have been seen as the pathway out of poverty. So the way countries can become rich is by developing a manufacturing sector. If that manufacturing sector is now dominated by AI and robots, it becomes much harder to see how developing countries make that leap. So, I mean, I think the negative kind of side of that is quite easy to see. On the positive side, I mean, I think what AI allows us to do is understand what's happening in the economy much better. It allows us to do this kind of big data analysis of who's vulnerable to shocks, who's going to be affected by shocks, and how. It gives us a better sense of how to design and implement development programs to protect those who are at risk. And potentially, it will create the kind of jobs that can be accessed online from anywhere in the world. This kind of, what you might, remote work, various forms of kind of remote work that can be accessed online. And that might create new opportunities. But I think we're really just too early in the spread of this technology to have a good sense of it. But I think it's certainly anyone who's working in development should be thinking about, and we certainly are trying to get our heads around it as quickly as we can, because I think these changes are going to be coming much faster than anyone is ready for.
No, I agree with that. And I would just add two things. One, at the American Academy, we actually have a multi-sectoral AI advisory committee, very senior leaders from across a number of sectors who are members of the Academy to think about this. And I actually think the poverty issue has not been raised. So that's something I'm happy to raise with them. For me, the biggest thing when it comes to AI is some misinformation, disinformation, and how that can be used to mobilize against the marginalized communities, which are the ones who are in extreme poverty. So whether it's targeting, certain sects, certain religions, certain ethnic groups, and using them, using AI to create this misinformation that then spreads rapidly through social media. That's, I think, something that many countries are looking at, and especially in the context of elections. But thinking of it outside the not-election period, I think, is also important. But the regulations, the developed world is still struggling with regulations around AI. So I think we'll be hard pressed to ask the developing world to start thinking about regulation. I think this is something where the UN, and they've had some conversations around this, but where they could theoretically step in and start developing some frameworks or convenings where some of these regulations can be considered.
Thank you so much, both. I just have one very quick follow-up, because you both are experts and have worked with Pakistan on many different policy issues. What do you think, how can Pakistan as a developing country amongst many others be better equipped to use AI as a tool that alleviates poverty instead of aggravates it?
I would actually go back to Tobias' point about using AI to look at large data sets and information that, historically, like someone had told me that in India, they have over 150 years of weather data, right? There should be similar data about rainfall patterns and droughts in Pakistan. That data is somewhere. How can AI be used to do that, to help better plan around seasonal, floods and droughts? And so, thinking about how AI, I would say that the government, if they're going to think about it, those would be the places to experiment, not with, I don't know if I'm not sure how AI could, I'm assuming that AI can be used for financial information as well, and that scares me. But I think using the, large data sets and making that information available, open source, so that other researchers and experts, technocrats, technical specialists can access that data to help better plan and do better development programs.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I don't see Pakistan as being the kind of country that attracts AI investment and becomes an AI research leader. Just the infrastructure is frankly not there. I do think we have a lot of English-speaking workers, highly educated population. We have a proven capacity to work in the tech sector. Tech exports are growing rapidly. There's a lot of startups, small businesses in that space. If AI kind of creates more of that, as I was saying before, those opportunities for innovative types of online work, I think that Pakistan's relatively well placed to take advantage of some of that. I mean, I certainly think that the if you have a country that has systems that are not fully developed in lots of these areas, like taxation or statistics or meteorology, data collection, a technology like AI comes along and it actually provides Pakistan with an opportunity to leapfrog, right? We don't necessarily need to go through some of the stages that other countries have gone through. We can go straight to the stage of picking up the latest solutions, and that may open some doors for us to do things much better than they're being done now. With big data, with analytics, with government digital strategy. I think the question really remains whether the government has the capacity and the foresight to pick up some of these potential solutions and be on the cutting edge of what's possible. So let's see. I mean, really, I know that's not a very good answer, but I think this is all so full of big questions and it's so unknown on so many dimensions that it's very hard to see what the impacts are going to be.
Well, with that, we're just about at time. So first of all, just want to say thank you to our gracious panelists for their time and for their very insightful perspectives on what are not easy questions to answer, whether at a domestic level or an international level. So thank you both for your perspectives on this pressing issue of poverty eradication. Thank you all to our attendees. Thank you to the American Pakistan Foundation again for supporting this event. With that, we hope that you have taken away some wonderful insights and things to chew on. So, and with that, want to wish you all a good afternoon or a good evening, depending on where you're at. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank
Much
you.
appreciated.
Thank you, everyone.